and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Senator from Iowa.
I object.
The objection is heard.
Well, Mr. President, reclaiming my time, that's unfortunate. That could dispose of this bill and pass this bill today. A very straightforward, expeditious way of passing this bill with no delay. Mr. President, I said I had a second choice path forward, which I think is very, very reasonable as well, related to the National Defense Authorization Act. So let me propose this unanimous consent. And I would ask unanimous consent that all remaining time on the motion to proceed to H.R. 3204, the compounding bill, be yielded back, that the Senate proceed to H.R. 3204, that the bill be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. I further ask that the Senate then proceed to the consideration of S. 1197, the National Defense Authorization Bill, that my amendment, which is at the desk, be called up, and that notwithstanding Rule 22, my amendment remain in order, that no second-degree amendments to my amendment be in order, and that the amendment be subject to a 60-vote affirmative threshold for passage.
Is there objection?
On behalf of the leadership, I object.
Objections heard.
Well, Mr. President, reclaiming my time again, I think that's unfortunate. That would be an even quicker route forward on the compounding bill, because had that unanimous consent been agreed to, the compounding bill would have just passed the Senate. It would have happened right now, and we would move on to something that clearly needs time for debate and discussion and amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act. So, Mr. President, in closing, let me just underscore, all I am seeking, urging, and yes, demanding, is a clear up or down vote on a pure disclosure provision. Let the public know, as I think they clearly have a right to, how each individual member is handling the situation. If a member actually has the gall, in my opinion, to say, no, all these people who work for me are not official staff, and therefore they can right out ignore the clear language and mandate of Obamacare that says Congress and all staff must go to the exchanges for their health care, people have a right to know that. And by the way, a lot of members, including myself, say no. We're all going to the exchanges. That's what the law says. It's perfectly clear, and that's what we're going to live by, and a lot of members are doing that. Either way, the public should know what's going on. There should be full disclosure, and that's all the provision I'm discussing today does. And so it has been completely cleared by hotline on the Republican side. There is no objection. I would urge us to move forward with a simple, straightforward vote on it so we can expedite consideration of this bill on the floor, so we can move more quickly to the National Defense Authorization Bill, which does merit a lot of significant floor time, so we can have amendment votes on that bill immediately and not have any controversy about that. And I urge that reasonable and expedited and clear path forward. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I want to say a couple things about my objections. I know a lot of senators, when they object, always use that phrase, reserving the right to object. But I think if you look in the Senate rules, there is no such provision for reserving a right to object. I've always made it my habit that if you object, and then when you get time on the floor, you explain why you objected. Thus, I'm taking my time now to explain why I objected. The senator from Louisiana propounded two unanimous consent requests. The first was basically that we go ahead and get to the bill, the compounding bill that we're on right now, that his amendment, which has nothing to do with the bill, by the way, and I think he would agree that, has nothing to do, it's not even relevant, not even germane to this bill, It has something to do with Obamacare and whether or not we tell people how our staffs are going on the exchange or not. So it has nothing to do with this bill. It seems odd that the senator from Louisiana says he wants the inalienable right to be able to offer an amendment to this bill, but no one can offer an amendment to his amendment. Kind of a double standard to my way of thinking. He says that they vote on his amendment and that no second-degree amendments be in order. Why not? If amendments were allowed to be in order on the bill that were non-germane and non-relevant, why shouldn't there be a second-degree amendment allowed on his amendment? Kind of a double standard. So he wants it all his way without thinking about the rest of the United States Senate. Well, again, that's why I keep saying we need the rules changed so that not one person can demand such outrageous accommodations. So, again, this bill is so important to get passed and to get to the President so we can begin this process of protecting the health and safety of the American people. And we know how to treat compounders and that they have to register and stop doing what they've been doing in the past. This is vitally important. Well, the senator says, well, we can expedite it if only you'll do it my way. Why should we have to do it his way when 97 people already voted on this bill when it passed the House by unanimous consent? Why should it be, well, this one senator has the right to stop this bill, slow it down, unless we meet the demands of that senator? Yeah, this is outrageous, I think, in terms of how we conduct our business in the United States Senate. Now, again, I have argued for a long time that rules need to be changed. I've also argued for a long time that the minority ought to have the right, the inalienable right, to offer amendments, but amendments that are relevant and germane to the bill before you. Otherwise, you get amendments on everything from Timbuktu to where? On any bill. And that you can keep offering them and offering them and offering them. It was my understanding that the majority leader offered to the senator from Louisiana an up or down vote on his amendment. Not on this bill, but on at some point, an up or down vote, as long as that was the definitive vote on the bill and that on the amendment, it wouldn't keep coming up. It's further my understanding that the senator disagreed with that he wanted the right to bring it up again and again and again and again and again. I think this is, again, is just an outrageous imposition of one senator's views and considerations on the entire United States Senate. So I would say to the senator that there ought to be some way for the senator to get an up or down vote on his amendment. Not on this bill. It's not relevant. It's not germane. I don't think it's relevant or germane on the defense bill. I'll say more about that in a second. But we got a lot of things coming down the pike here before we leave here this year, or even in the next session of this Congress, to accommodate the senator from Louisiana on his amendment. But why should we have to keep voting on it time after time after time if we have one dispositive vote on it, up or down, which is, as I understand, that the majority leader offered? Secondly, as regards the second unanimous consent proffered by the senator from Louisiana, to which I objected on behalf of the majority leader, I am not the chairman of the Defense Authorization Committee, nor do I have the right to bring legislation to the floor. Again, the senator wants everything accommodated to his wishes, because if you read the unanimous consent, the senator asked the Senate then proceed, well, there's a word missing there, it means to the consideration of S. 1197, the Defense Authorization Bill. That's the right of the majority leader. That's the majority leader's right to bring legislation on the floor. Not my right, not the senator from Louisiana's right, not the senator from any place else. I don't know if the majority leader wants to go to the Defense Authorization Bill or not, next or not. I don't know, but that's not my decision to make. But the senator from Louisiana says he wants to make that decision and to make sure the Senate does just that. Well, I'd say to the senator from Louisiana, well, when he becomes majority leader, then he would have that right. So again, he wants, again, to be able to bring up his amendment, again, which has nothing basically to do with the defense authorization bill. And again, that no second-degree amendment be in order on his amendment. Again, a little bit of a double standard. He wants the right to offer a non-germane, non-relevant amendment to a bill, but nobody can offer any amendments to his amendment in the second degree. Well, I think we see this for what it is. The senator obviously wants to vote on his amendment maybe today and maybe tomorrow and maybe next week and maybe next month, and I don't know how many times he wants to vote on his amendment. He was offered the right for an up or down dispositive vote, up or down on that amendment. But it's my understanding, and it's only my understanding, I don't know whether this is correct or not, but that was turned down by the senator from Louisiana. So I say that's why I objected to both of those. On the one, because of the compounding bill, the necessity to get it through, and I don't know whether the senator's amendment would fail or lose. I don't know, but I do know that the House has said that they will not take the compounding bill back. Now, you might say that the House is unreasonable in that. I don't run the House. I don't run the House. All I know is the House passed it by unanimous consent, sent it over here, and said if it is amended, they will not then revisit it. Well, that's what the House said. So if the senator's amendment, as worthy as it might be to some, if it's put on the compounding bill, that is the end of the compounding bill. That's the end of protecting the people of America, their health and their safety that we've worked so hard on to come together on this bill. That's why it has no place on this bill. It may have a place, and I say that the senator should have a right for a vote on his amendment at some point on either a relevant bill or a freestanding bill that the senator gets the right to up or down vote on his amendment, either as a freestanding bill itself or as a relevant or germane amendment to some other bill that's on the floor. He should have that right, but not to stymie, to stop a bill that is so vital to the health and safety of the American people. So that's why I object. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the comments of the distinguished floor manager. I just want to respond very briefly. My goal is a clear up or down vote on this pure disclosure proposal, and I am open for suggestions for that to happen in any reasonable time frame, meaning this calendar year. I've focused on these two bills simply because it seems to me, from what I know of the Senate schedule and floor activity, these are going to be the only opportunities in terms of amendment votes. But if there are other opportunities we can identify for this year, if we can identify an opportunity for a vote on a freestanding bill, I am all ears, and I'm completely open to that, and I want more amendment votes in the Senate, not fewer. And if there's a side-by-side idea, that's fine by me. I'm completely open to that. I simply made these concrete suggestions because, based on what I know of the majority leader's plans for the rest of the calendar year, these are going to be the amendment opportunities. And by the way, the only reason I put in my second consent to turn to the defense bill is because that is exactly what the majority leader articulated as his desire and his plan, to turn to that as soon as possible to take up amendments. So I am open for any reasonable opportunity this year for this vote. And again, this is a pure disclosure provision. I don't see why it should be partisan or controversial, and it has been cleared through hotline on my side. So if there are any other suggestions of how this can happen, I'm completely open to that. Unfortunately, I had a phone call with the distinguished majority leader last week and proposed various options, and his response was simply no. No, 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 no other ideas, no other options, no. But I'm completely open to those other ideas. Obviously, it's part of the tradition of the Senate that non-germane amendments are considered all the time. In fact, with regard to the defense bill, that's the norm, not the exception. There are usually significant non-germane amendments, often by the majority side, sometimes by the majority leadership, which are critical votes on the defense authorization bill. That's not unusual at all. And I'm for more amendment votes. And if there are alternative ideas on this topic, more amendment votes there, not fewer. So I look forward to moving forward in a productive, effective way toward getting this simple vote on disclosure and toward moving in an expedited way through this bill and to the defense bill and whatever else is on the Senate calendar as determined by the majority leader. But again, so far the response is no across the board, not any sort of alternative suggestion. Finally, with regard to the idea of having one vote and one vote early, there is a clear practical problem with agreeing to that, and that is the following. For instance, what if there was one vote on my disclosure provision on the Defense Authorization Act? That bill is going to a conference committee. So it would obviously be possible for my amendment to be adopted 100-0 and then be dumped in the conference committee and stripped from the bill. And then I would have foregone the opportunity to ever bring up the subject again this entire Congress. I mean, that's a fool's agreement, and I'm not going to agree to a fool's agreement. I need to be able to protect my rights to revisit the issue, particularly when it would pass through a vote under that scenario and then be stripped in conference. So I hope we find a productive way forward. Again, this is a pure disclosure provision. I'm asking for a simple up or down vote in whatever context presents itself this calendar year, this bill, the defense bill, and I'm open to other suggestions. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Senator from Nevada.
I ask unanimous consent to speak as if morning business for 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin, I'd like to offer my condolences to my friend and colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Inhofe, and his family on the tragic loss of their son. Both my wife and I will continue to keep their entire family in our thoughts and prayers during this very difficult time. Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the President's broken promises on Obamacare and their effects on the people of Nevada. For more than a month now, the American people have witnessed just how poorly this burdensome law has been implemented. People all over the country are frustrated with the problems plaguing healthcare.gov, as they should be. The government spent hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars to overpromise and underdeliver on the signature legislation of this administration. But there are serious problems in addition to the website, and one glaring issue in particular that I would like to focus on today. We've all heard from the law's supporter that Obamacare would give uninsured Americans access to health insurance. Time and time again, they promised that people who already had their health plan could keep it. In fact, President Obama made the exact promise on numerous occasions. In a speech to the American Medical Association in June of 2009, President Obama said this: "No matter how we reform the health care, we will keep this promise to the American people. If you like your doctor, you will be able to keep your doctor, period. If you like your health care plan, you'll be able to keep your health care plan, period." But one of my constituents sent me a letter last week telling me that that wasn't the case. Sonny from Las Vegas area wrote, "I wanted to tell you that we have lost our wonderful health insurance plan." Sonny's family received a letter from their insurance company telling them that their existing plan didn't qualify under the Affordable Care Act. they were automatically reassigned to a new plan that costs about $400 more per month. Let's remember what the President said, this time in August of 2009, during his weekly presidential address about what he called phony claims regarding health reform. If you like your private health insurance plan, you can keep that plan, period. But yet another one of my constituents, Kirk from Northern Nevada, was just notified that his current health insurance had been canceled. He went to the exchange to find a new policy and shared his story with me. And he wrote, "Despite higher deductibles and higher copays, my new insurance under this devastating law will be more than 250% of what I am paying now." And again, March 15, 2010, just a few days before the law was passed, albeit unread, by a party-line vote and signed into law, President Obama said this: "If you like your plan, you can keep your plan. And if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor." I wonder how President Obama and the law supporters would explain that statement to Mark in Reno. Mark received a letter telling him that his current plan was no longer offered. The plan, the letter detailed, was canceled in order to, quote-unquote, meet the requirements of the new laws. Mark was given the option to keep his plan for one additional year if he accepted a rate increase, even though he just saw a rate increase in September. Mark goes on to tell me, and I quote, "As an individual health care plan holder and a self-employed individual, the ACA appeared to punish me for doing the right thing by having a health care plan for the past 10 years and rewards those who did not," end quote. But yet, as recently as past July, President Obama promised this: if you already have health care, the only thing this bill does is make sure that it's even more secure and insurance companies can't jerk you around. President Obama made this statement more than 2 years after the administration admitted in comments in the Federal Register that 40 to 67% of existing individual policies would lose their grandfather status. The President knew that millions of Americans stood to lose their existing policies, but he repeatedly told the American public under no uncertain terms that they could keep their plans. I think Stephen from Washoe County would likely take issue with that promise. He told me that he now has health care that costs $293 per month. However, he just received a letter from his health care provider informing him that the cost of his health care would increase to $546 per month on January 1st. That means his health insurance costs will nearly double next year. There's nothing affordable about that. There's nothing secure about that. On September 26th, just days before the exchanges opened to a disastrous rollout, the President repeated yet again what this administration knew wasn't true. The first thing you need to know is this: if you already have health care, you don't have to do anything. Well, I have another letter here from a father from Reno. He writes, "I'm writing to tell you that I'm now eating crow. A few weeks back, I wrote to you and expressed my support for the health reform and my dissatisfaction with the government shutdown. Since then, I've received notification from my insurance company informing me that my current policy is being discontinued. I then began shopping for a new policy for myself and my family and have found that rates are 2 to 3 times what I'm currently paying and that my max out-of-pocket will double, all for basically the same plan as what I have now. In essence, I've been put into a situation where I can either save for my kids' college education or buy health care." But this particular letter closes with something that really highlights the tough financial decisions facing the American people in these difficult economic times. This father says, I'm unfortunately one of those people who makes too much money to qualify for federal subsidy, but not enough to sell my house, which is still underwater from the housing crisis of 2008. This is the reality of the health care law. Now, in addition to trying to save for his children's education and attempting to recover from the housing crisis, a father has been forced off the plan he liked, and the options available are 2 or 3 times more expensive. These stories don't fit with the narrative that we've heard for nearly 5 years. Now President Obama is trying to backtrack on the dozens of times he made his promise to the American people. Just last week he said, "Now, if you have or had one of these plans before the Affordable Act came into law, and you really liked that plan, what we said was you can keep it if it hasn't changed since that law passed." Now, that's just not true. That is not what he promised. And now my constituents are receiving cancellation notices for their existing plans. The administration argues that even though many people are losing their existing plans, those plans were subpar policies and their new policies will be better. But that ignores the promise. Mr. President, my constituents liked their plans. They decided what was best for them, what plan fits their individual and family needs. The President and the administration knew before the legislation passed that millions of Americans would lose their current plans. They admitted it in the Federal Register after the bill was signed into law. But the whole time they continued to promote this promise and dismiss any concerns as fear-mongering or phony claims. And that, Mr. President, is unacceptable. These personal stories is why I'm proud to co-sponsor the If You Like Your Health Plan, You Can Keep It Act, introduced by my colleague, Senator Johnson from Wisconsin. This is a simple but necessary bill to give Americans the ability to keep their health plan if they like them. The people of Nevada deserve better, and they deserve to have a government that keeps its promises. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I'd ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reports are emerging of another school shooting today. Early reports out of Pittsburgh that 3 people have been shot at a high school there. The police right now are searching for the shooter in the woods surrounding the high school. We hope and we pray that the 3 reported victims will survive. But this is just becoming a regular part of our work week here in Washington. We can expect at some point during the week that we are going to turn on the TV onto one of the cable news networks and find a live report from a school or a mall or a church somewhere out in this country where a shooting is in progress. It's happening at a rate that I don't think any of us could have expected. And this number, Mr. President, is growing at a rate that I don't think any of us could have expected. I brought this chart down to the floor of the Senate now for going on about 6 months since the failure of our common sense anti-gun violence bill this spring. And this number represents the number of Americans who have died through gun violence since December 14th. December 14th means something to everybody in this chamber, but certainly to those of us from Connecticut, that's the day in which 26 6- and 7-year-olds and the teachers that protected them died in Sandy Hook. 10,000 people, 465 additional, have died. And I've been trying to come down to the Senate floor since the failure of that bill to just try to tell the stories of these victims. Because if statistics don't do the job, if the sheer numbers alone don't convince people that something should change, well, then maybe hearing about who these people are might change things. We hope that we won't add to this number with some new young victims from the reported shooting in Pittsburgh today. These shootings happen in unlikely places. Schools now, unfortunately, are a likely place for a shooting to happen because they seem to happen with some regularity in schools, in part because we do very little, if anything, to stop them with legislation from this chamber. But they're happening in other unlikely places as well. Clubs, for instance, in New Haven, Connecticut, have been the sighting 4 times just this year of major shootings. Just a few weeks ago, on October 26th, police in New Haven responded to an early Saturday morning shooting at a place called the Key Club Cabaret. They got there and found that 26-year-old Erica Robinson had been killed in a shooting spree that also injured 19-year-old Amanda John, 29-year-old Jihad Brumsey, 24-year-old Nijia Ward, and 34-year-old Albert Dickerson, as well as 25-year-old Yvette Sterling. Officers rushed to the scene as hundreds of patrons were running out. They walked in and found 6 victims of gun violence. Just a dispute in a club resulting in the death of Erica Robinson and several more being injured. Just a few days ago in Cypress, Texas, there was another shooting in a club in which 2 high school students were killed and 19 others were injured. Actually, this was at a house party. Shortly before 11 p.m. on November 9th, 2013, there was a house party celebrating a young woman's 18th birthday. And because of a local dispute between 2 rival groups, Querick Denarius Bernard Richardson, 17 years old, was killed, and Ariel Shepard as well. According to authorities, Richardson was shot in the head while he was running away from the house party. When students returned to school on Monday, there was a lot of crying as they mourned the death of 2 of their classmates. School parties celebrating 18th birthdays, clubs in places like New Haven, Bridgeport, Connecticut, places you don't think that you're going to end up being shot at when you walk into, are now the scenes of pretty vicious shootings, as are our schools. And, Mr. President, shootings are increasingly happening in another way as well, by accident. I, unfortunately, in preparation for a lot of these speeches, rifle through a lot of pretty grisly reports. And increasingly, you're seeing more and more accidental shootings ending up in tragedy. In Waterbury, Connecticut, again, just a few weeks ago, Dow Kling and Sean French, both 22 years old, were playing around with their .22 caliber Ruger inside an apartment in Waterbury when the gun went off and Dow was shot to death. His best friend, Sean French, who shot him, said, "I'm sorry. I wish it was me and not him. I wish I could trade places with him. I really do." A week earlier in Henderson, Nevada, just another example by which Sharice Pincombe was playing around with a gun with her friend Colin Lowry, and the Remington 45 was loaded, and they didn't know it was loaded and shot Sharice dead. 23 years old, described as an amazing coworker, so caring. She was kind. She was always helpful. She always wanted to do something to help out. She was just generous. And just because they didn't understand the gun was loaded and they were being reckless, playing around with a firearm, Sharice is dead. And so that's why people out there don't understand why we can't have an honest conversation about changing things. And even when those conversations are attempted to take place, they get shut down and cut off. A pretty innocent op-ed piece in the Guns and Ammo magazine just suggested that maybe people should get a few hours of training before they get a concealed carry permit. And as a consequence of running that editorial, the editor of Guns and Ammo had to resign and step down simply because he ran an op-ed by an author that suggested that maybe people should get some training before they have a concealed weapon. And so even when we try to engage in these discussions, we can't have them because the folks that get their money from the gun industry, whether it be the NRA or these magazines, aren't even allowed to have these conversations, despite the fact that 84% of gun owners support universal background checks, despite the fact that 50% of gun owners support a restriction on high-capacity ammunition clips, despite the fact that 46% of gun owners think that it's a good idea to ban high-powered assault weapons. Organizations like Guns and Ammo or the NRA are out of step with gun owners who don't want to see this number continue increasing, who don't want to turn on the TV to see another school shooting. The reason that I come down here, Mr. President, to talk about who these victims are is because the conscience of this nation should be enough to move this place to action. And it's about time that gun owners and non-gun owners alike get together to do something about this. There is much more agreement than there is disagreement amongst both people who own guns and people who choose not to own guns. And whether it's background checks or a ban on illegal gun trafficking or just a simple requirement that you get a little bit of training on how to use a gun so that you don't fire it accidentally and end up shooting your best friend, there are simple, common sense, bipartisan things that we can do to make sure that this number doesn't continue to accelerate at the pace that it has since December 14th. I thank the Chamber for its time. I yield back and note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
May I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted?
Without objection.
Thank you very much. May I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to speak as if in morning business for up to 20 minutes?
Without objection.
Thank you. And Mr. President, I am here today for now the 50th time to urge my colleagues to wake up to what carbon pollution is doing to our atmosphere and our oceans. Once a week, 50 weeks, every week. Why? Why do I do this? Well, first, because it's real. It's very real. It's happening. Here's the change in average global surface temperature since 1970. It's pretty hard to deny. Of course, if you are a denier, you will look at it and you will see from the same data that it stopped. Well, what the deniers who tell you that it stopped don't tell you is that, yeah, and it stopped 5 times earlier on the way up. In fact, you could say that climate change has stopped 6 times since the 1970s and even went down, but it didn't stay stopped long. Look at the linear trend for the whole data set from 1970 to 2013. No one can deny over this period that the Earth is warming. This decade was warmer than the last, which was warmer than the one before that, which was warmer than the one before that. Let's look at NASA's entire historical surface temperature record going back to the 19th century. Listen to what University of California, Berkeley physics professor Richard Muller has to say about the temperature record. The frequent rises and falls, virtually a stair-step pattern, are part of the historic record, and there's no expectation that they will stop, whatever their cause. The land temperature record is full of fits and starts that make the upward trend vanish for short periods. Regardless of whether we understand them, there is no reason to expect them to stop. And here you can see again these short steps in the upward march. One reason we can't expect these upward steps to stop is that we know what's driving them. What's driving climate change is something even contrarian scientists accept. That is, more carbon dioxide leads to more warming. Simple as that. A 150-year-old established basic principle of physics. This is the October 1861 edition of the London, Edinburgh, and Dublin Philosophical Magazine and Journal of Science. It includes a manuscript by physicist John Tyndall entitled Radiation of Heat by Gases and Vapors. He says, to account for different amounts of heat being preserved to the Earth at different times, a slight change in the atmosphere's variable constituents would suffice for this. Such changes, in fact, may have produced all the mutations of climate which the researches of geologists reveal. The variable constituents to which Tyndall refers include carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. That's from 1861. President Lincoln took office that year. And here we are today having to explain on the floor of the United States Senate the physics of what carbon dioxide does in the atmosphere. It's not just the principle that's established. There are lots of measurements. The carbon dioxide in our atmosphere now exceeds 400 parts per million. For the last 800,000 years at least, 800,000 years, and perhaps actually millions of years, we have been in a range of 170 to 300 parts per million. That's been the whole of human existence. Homo sapiens has been around for about 200,000 of those 800,000 years. And it's only now, it's only since the Industrial Revolution that we've broken out of that safe window that has protected us through that entire history of our species, and now we've broken to 400. And that's a measurement. Look at the oceans. Oceans have absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat caused by greenhouse gases over the last 50 years. Absorbing all that heat makes the oceans rise. Oceans have absorbed about 30% of our carbon emissions, which would otherwise be in the atmosphere causing more warming. Absorbing that carbon makes the oceans more acidic. And that's all stuff we measure. At the Newport tide gauge, sea level is up almost 10 inches since the 1930s, when we had our catastrophic 38 hurricane in Rhode Island. You measure that. It takes basically a ruler. We're about 3 to 4 degrees warmer in the winter in Narragansett Bay than we were 50 years ago when my wife's URI mentor was doing his doctoral thesis. 3 to 4 degrees. You measure that. It takes a thermometer. And the ocean is acidifying at the fastest rate recorded in 50 million years. You measure that with a litmus test, which anybody with an aquarium does. It's one thing to be against science. It's another to be the party against measurement. So the polluters and front groups don't talk much about the oceans. But that doesn't change the fact this is real, and it is past denying. So that takes me to the second reason I do this, and that is that it is plain, old-fashioned wrong when people lie and trick other people, particularly when people are going to be hurt by the lies. And it's worse when there's money behind the trickery, when it's purposeful. Lies cannot go unanswered, and that is another reason that I speak. And there isn't just lying going on. There's a whole carefully built apparatus. Phony baloney organizations designed to look and sound like they're real, messages honed by public relations experts to sound like they're true, payroll scientists whom polluters can trot out when they need them, and the whole thing big and complicated enough you could be fooled into thinking it's not all the same beast. But it is. It's like the mythical Hydra. Many heads, same beast. One day, folks are going to look back at this, and those behind it are going to be disgraced for what they did. And it's going to be a scandal. And that's the third reason I speak. We are all going to be judged very harshly, with all the dread power that history has to inflict on wrong. The polluters and their collaborators will be judged harshly. The Republican Party will be judged harshly for letting itself be led astray by them. But, and here's where it really hurts, the failure of American democracy this is causing will also be judged harshly. And that will stain the reputation of our great American experiment. We in this generation have been past this precious experiment by generations before us that fought and bled and died to put it safely in our hands. And we do this. We foul it by lying and denying for a bunch of polluters. Some generation we're going to be. If you believe this world needs America, this matters. Because a world fouled and changed by carbon pollution in ways we could foresee but denied will not believe it has much of a need for what a lying and denying America has to offer. This episode will darken the lamp that America holds up to the world. We are a great country, but not when we're lying and denying what's real. The atmosphere is warming. Ice is melting. Seas are warming, rising, and acidifying, and it's time for the misleading fantasies to end. Mr. President, here's how we go forward. First, price carbon right. Make the big carbon polluters pay a fee to the American people, as I've proposed with Representatives Waxman and Blumenauer and Senator Schatz. A pollution fee to cover the cost of dumping their waste into our atmosphere and oceans, a cost which they now happily push off to the rest of us. I know, at present, political conditions do not allow us to price carbon. So we must change those political conditions. And we can. Recently, President Obama changed the calculus for polluters. Carbon pollution standards for new and existing power plants. No more unchecked carbon dumping. 50 power plants emit 1 out of every 8 tons of America's carbon dioxide emissions. These 50 dirtiest U.S. power plants emit more than Canada, emit more than Korea. When the big polluters see the cost of complying with those new standards coming down at them, they may take a second look at an economy-wide carbon fee. And here's a news flash. When the polluters' calculus begins to change, the political calculus here in Congress will change too. Nothing says we have to wait for the polluters to figure this out on their schedule. There are armies on our side. It's not just the environmental groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council, League of Conservation Voters, Environmental Defense Fund, Sierra Club, or National Wildlife Federation. It's not just virtually every major scientific organization like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Geophysical Union, and the American Meteorological Society. We have faith-based groups like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the National Council of the Churches of Christ, Interfaith Power and Light, the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. We have fishing, wildlife, and outdoor groups like Trout Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, and Ducks Unlimited. They're joined by major sports leagues like the National Football League, Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, the National Hockey League, as well as the American Lung Association, who prefer to see kids playing outside in clean, healthy air. We have the Joint Chiefs of Staff on our side, joined by NASA, the national academies, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, even the Government Accountability Office, the congressional watchdog. And by the way, about NASA, let's not forget, NASA scientists sent an SUV-sized rover to Mars. They landed it safely on Mars, and they're driving it around on Mars right now. I'll put NASA scientists up against the polluters' payroll scientists all day long. We've got insurers and reinsurers whose business depends on understanding the mounting risk of natural disasters. Folks like Munich Re, Swiss Re, Allianz, and the Reinsurance Association of America. We've got state and local governments who are already acting. 9 northeastern states, for instance, including my own Rhode Island, engage in cap and trade through RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. 4 Florida counties share resources and strategies for adapting to climate change through a bipartisan Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. And those are just 2 examples of many from around the country. A coalition of investors worth nearly $3 trillion just wrote to 45 fossil fuel companies seeking explanations about risks facing their fossil fuel investments. Divestment campaigns are popping up at college campuses across the nation. Major utilities accept the science and are investing in renewables and improving efficiency. Energy companies PG&E, the Public Service Company of New Mexico, and Exelon all quit the U.S. Chamber of Commerce after a chamber official called for putting climate science on trial like the Scopes monkey trial of 1925. America's flagship companies like General Motors, Ford, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nike, Apple, Walmart, and Alcoa all recognize the serious implications of climate change. This support is latent, though, and it's unorganized. It's time to wake up and to gather our armies. We've got to create allied command, assemble our divisions, agree on a strategy, go into action. That will affect the calculus in Congress. And most importantly, Mr. President, we have the American people. 65% of voters support the president, quote, taking significant steps to address climate change now. 65%. Another poll found that 82% of Americans believe we should start preparing now for rising sea levels and severe storms from climate change. Those in Congress who would deny science to protect the polluting interests increasingly look ridiculous even to their own side. Misleading statements in the media, like the stuff purveyed by the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, are losing their battle and losing their audience. It's not just time to wake up. People are waking up, and inevitably the truth will be fully known. But the polls show clearly that climate denial is a losing tactic. 4 out of 5 voters under 35 support the president taking action to address climate change. 52% of young Republican voters would be less likely to vote for someone who opposed the president's climate action plan. Even a majority of Texans say more should be done about global warming by all levels of government, with 62% of Texans saying more should be done in Congress. And for those last holdout deniers comes this. 53% of young Republican voters under age 35, said that they would describe a climate denier as, quote, ignorant, quote, out of touch, or, quote, crazy. Republicans outside of Congress are trying to lead their party back to reality and away from what even young Republicans are calling ignorant, out of touch, and crazy extremist views. They support a revenue-neutral carbon fee. Republicans like our former colleagues in Congress, Sherwood Boehlert, Wayne Gilchrist, and Robert Inglis. Republicans like former Environmental Protection Agency administrators William Ruckelshaus, Lee Thomas, William Riley, and Christine Todd Whitman, who served under Presidents Nixon, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, respectively. Advisors to former Republican presidents like President Reagan's Secretary of State George Shultz, Reagan's economic policy advisor Art Laffer, known as Reagan's economist, and David Frum, speechwriter for George W. Bush. And here's what the Republican presidential nominee had to say 5 years ago, and I quote, "In the end, we're all left with the same set of facts. The facts of global warming demand our urgent attention, especially in Washington. Good stewardship, prudence, and simple common sense demand that we act to meet the challenge and act quickly. We have many advantages in the fight against global warming, but time is not one of them. The fundamental incentives of the market are still on the side of carbon-based energy. This has to change before we can make the decisive shift away from fossil fuels. There were costs we weren't counting, and these terrible costs have added up now in the atmosphere, in the oceans, and all across the natural world. We Americans like to say that there is no problem we can't solve, however complicated, and no obstacle we cannot overcome if we meet it together. I believe this about our country. I know this about our country, and now it is time for us to show those qualities once again." End quote. It is indeed time for us to show those qualities once again. It is time to wake up. It is time to turn back from the misleading propaganda of the polluters, the misguided extremism of the Tea Party, and the mistaken belief that we can ignore without consequence the harm that our carbon pollution is causing. It is time to face facts, be adults, and meet our responsibilities. Mr. President, I give these speeches because climate change is real, because the campaign of denial is as poisonous to our democracy as carbon pollution is to our atmosphere and oceans, and because I am confident. I am confident that we can do this. We can strengthen our economy. We can redirect our future. We can protect our democracy. And we can do our duty to the generations that will follow us and that will look back in shame unless we change our program. But we have to pay attention, Mr. President. We have to wake up. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I come to the floor once again to talk about jobs and economic growth. We are continuing to see signs of a steadily improving economy, with more than 200,000 jobs created last